Welcome back, dear listeners. There is a particular kind of cold that settles into a story before anything has even happened in it. The kind that makes you pull a blanket closer without quite knowing why. Tonight is one of those stories. Before we go any further, tell me who is sitting with me tonight. Are you under a lamp while the rest of the house has gone quiet? On a late drive home with the heater running? Perhaps your hands are busy with something, knitting, folding washing, stirring a pot, while your mind wanders off somewhere colder. Tell me below. I read every comment. Tonight's case is inspired by the canon of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and the world of Sherlock Holmes, a new mystery built in that old tradition. No rights claimed. Now, the snow is already falling over the castle gate. Let us go inside. Sherlock Holmes, The Witch of Eldenstone Castle. Chapter 1. The Girl from the Marches. It was in the January of a hard winter, some years before the old century gave way to the new, that a young woman came alone to our rooms in Baker Street, and brought with her a story I have never been able to set down without a measure of the cold that hung about it from the first word. I remember the morning clearly because Holmes had been 3 days at his chemical table, the room reeking of something acrid, and had spoken perhaps a dozen words to me since Monday. He was, in those moods, a poor companion and a worse correspondent, and it took the sound of a cab drawing up below, and then a hurried, uncertain step on the stair, to draw him from his retorts at all. Mrs. Hudson showed her in without announcement, which told me at once that the girl had said something at the door to move her past the usual formalities. She was perhaps 22, dressed for travel rather than for a London call, her boots still carrying the mud of a country road, and she stood just inside the door as though she had not quite decided whether she had the right to come further. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I am sorry. I did not send ahead. There was no time to send ahead." Holmes set down the flask he had been holding and looked at her with the particular attention he reserved for people who interested him before they had said anything of substance. "You have come from the west," he said. "By the night train, I think, and changed twice, the second time in some haste, for you have buttoned your left glove over the right one's button. You did not sleep, and you have been afraid for some days before you decided to come, or you would have come sooner." She looked down at her hands, as though seeing them for the first time, and laughed, not from amusement, but from the release of having been understood without having to explain herself. "My name is Eleanor Eldenstone," she said. "My father is Sir Aubrey Eldenstone, of Eldenstone Castle, on the border. I have left home without telling him where I have gone, which he will not forgive easily, and I have come to ask you to do the same thing, to come without telling him why, before something happens that none of us can put right afterward." She sat when Holmes offered the chair, and told her story plainly, in the manner of a woman who had gone over it many times in her own head on the long ride east, and had worn the excess language off it. The castle, she said, was a real one, half in ruin, built against the Welsh hills some 400 years before, and lived in by her family for the last 150 of them. There was an old story attached to it, as there is to most such houses, of a woman hanged or driven out for witchcraft generations back, whose ghost was said to walk the keep when misfortune was coming to the family. She did not believe it, she said, with the particular firmness of someone who wished to be reassured rather than agreed with. But something had altered in the house in the last fortnight. Her father's oldest friend, Mr. Idris Vaughan, the parish antiquarian who had kept the Chronicle of Eldenstone for 40 years, had taken on a young assistant from London to help him catalogue the castle's older papers, a Mr. Silas Quayle, quiet and capable, well liked by the household. Since his arrival, there had been lights seen in the old keep at hours when no one had business there, and twice a frostmark like a hand had appeared on the inside of a window that had been shut and unlatched from within. She might have set this aside as servants' talk, she said, had she not overheard her father and Mr. Vaughan, 3 nights before she left, speaking in the library in voices pitched low enough that she had caught only fragments through the door. Her father had said the word abroad twice. Mr. Vaughan had said something about a register and about being careful, and about not bringing it to anyone until he was certain. "I do not know what it concerns," she said. "I only know that Mr. Vaughan has not slept well since, and that my father will not speak of it, and that the village has begun to say the witch has come back because of it, which means someone closer to the truth has let the rest of it leak out as superstition. I am afraid for Mr. Vaughan, Mr. Holmes. I do not know of what. I only know I am afraid, and that no one at home will tell me why, and that I had rather be thought a foolish girl who ran to London than sit at home and wait to find out I was right." Holmes was quiet for a moment, turning the stem of his pipe between his fingers. "You did well to come," he said at last. "Fear of an unnamed thing is not, as a rule, evidence of anything but nerves. But a parish chronicle, a careful old man frightened by what he has found in it, and a household willing to let a ghost story cover whatever is actually troubling them, that is a different matter. Watson, what is the next train west?" I told him there was one within the hour if we hurried, and within that hour we were in a cab for Paddington. Miss Eldenstone between us with her hands folded tightly in her lap, and Holmes already silent again, though this time I knew the silence for what it was, the particular stillness of a man assembling a case before he has been given half its pieces. It was only as the train drew out through the grey edge of London that he spoke again, and then only to say, half to himself, that a man does not catalogue a family's old papers for 40 years without learning which of them are dangerous, and that the danger of an old secret is rarely in the secret itself, but in who first decides to disturb it. I did not understand him then. I had cause to remember the remark very exactly within 2 days. Chapter 2. The Road to Eldenstone. We changed trains twice more before the light began to fail, and by the time we reached the small border station nearest the castle, the snow that had been threatening all the way from London had begun in earnest, fine and steady, the kind that does not announce itself with drama, but simply continues until the world is altered. A trap was waiting, sent by Sir Aubrey on the strength of a telegram Miss Eldenstone had sent from the junction, and we drove the last 4 miles in near silence, the hedgerows white, the hills beyond them lost in a colourless dusk. Holmes sat with his collar up, and his eyes moving over the country in the particular way he had when a place was new to him, and he intended that it should not stay that way for long. "A castle and a hill farm, and very little between them," he said once. "A man could come and go across these fields for a week, and never be seen, if he knew the ground. Remember that, Watson. Eldenstone Castle, when we came to it, was not the ruin Miss Eldenstone's description had led me to expect, but a working house built into and around the bones of an older one. A square medieval keep at its heart, with 2 centuries of additions grown out from it like ivy from a wall. Lights showed in perhaps a dozen windows. A man in a heavy coat was waiting at the door with a lantern, and from his face, before a word was spoken, I knew that we had arrived too late for whatever Miss Eldenstone had hoped to prevent. "Eleanor," he said, and the catch in his voice told the rest before he managed it in words. "It is Vaughan. He is dead. Pritchard found him an hour ago in the ice house by the keep wall." I will not set down at length the look on the girl's face. She had ridden 4 miles in dread of exactly this, and the arrival of it did not make it easier to bear, only confirmed what she had already begun, on the train, to grieve for. Sir Aubrey Eldenstone was a heavy, grey man of perhaps 60, with the manner of one more used to giving orders about livestock and tenancies than to receiving bad news in his own hall. He looked at Holmes and at me with the particular suspicion of a countryman for strangers brought home by his daughter without his leave, but Holmes's introduction of himself and the mention that we had come at Miss Eldenstone's request before the news had reached London at all seemed to settle something in him. He was, I think, in that first hour, simply glad of any presence that might take a decision off his hands. The ice house stood some 40 yards from the keep, a squat stone building banked into the hillside, its door facing the open ground between the wall and the old orchard. A groundsman named Pritchard, a heavy, slow-spoken Welshman, had gone there at dusk to fetch ice for the kitchen and found the door bolted from the outside, the heavy iron bar dropped into its bracket, and when he had lifted it and gone in, had found Mr. Vaughan inside, seated against the wall with his coat drawn about him, dead some hours, by the look of him, of the cold. Holmes asked to see the place at once, before the light went entirely, and Sir Aubrey, perhaps grateful for an instruction he did not have to give himself, sent for lanterns. The snow had stopped falling an hour or so before our arrival, and what remained on the ground between the keep wall and the ice-house lay clean and undisturbed except for one line of footprints, a man's boots, walking steadily from the direction of the keep door to the ice-house door. I counted them twice in the lantern light, and so, I saw, did Holmes, on his knees in the snow, with no apparent regard for his trousers. There was only the one line. It went to the door. It did not come away from it. "The bar was down when Pritchard found it," Holmes said, "not quite to me, and no man's prints leave this building besides his own going in. Sir Aubrey, who else has reason to come to this part of the grounds after dark?" "No one," the squire said. "It is shut for the season. There would be nothing for anyone to do here once the ice is cut and stored until the spring." Holmes stood, brushing the snow from his knees, and looked for a long moment at the dark line of the keep wall above us, where an old window, deep-set and half-blocked with rubble, showed black against the stone. "Then we have a man who walked alone into a locked building," he said, "and was locked into it by someone who did not walk there at all. I should like very much to know how that was done before I trouble myself with why, Watson, though I confess the why is beginning to interest me a good deal as well." We went into the house in the last of the light, the body already carried up under blankets by Pritchard and two of the farm men, and I do not think any of us, walking back across that clean white ground, failed to look once over a shoulder at the dark old keep behind us, though not one of us would have admitted it. Chapter 3. Stones older than the squire. The household that received us that night was not so much grieving as braced, in the manner of people waiting to be told how much worse a thing might yet become. Sir Aubrey's elder son, Charles, a tall, restless young man of perhaps 30, had come in late from somewhere about the farm, with snow still on his boots, and a manner so careful that I marked it before Holmes said a word about it. Lady Eldenstone kept to her room with a headache. Real or convenient I could not yet say. The housekeeper, a stout, capable woman named Mrs. Tudor, fed us at an hour better suited to supper than to the questions Holmes had for her, and answered them well, in the way of a woman who has run a house long enough to know exactly how much to say, and no more. It was from her, and afterward from the village doctor sent for to examine the body, that the shape of Mr. Vaughan's last days began to come clear. He had been a careful man, Dr. Meredith said, 70 years of age, sound of heart so far as the doctor had ever known, and the body showed no mark of violence at all, no wound, no bruise beyond what a man might take from leaning against a stone wall for some hours in great discomfort. Death, in the doctor's plain opinion, was simply the cold, working on an old man through a night with no fire, and no door he could open from within. He would have called out, Mrs. Tudor said. He would have beaten on that door till his hands bled. Surely, sir, before he gave it up. He may have done both, Holmes said, and still not been heard, if the wind was from the hill that night, and the household was abed, an hour before he was missed. It was Mrs. Tudor, pressed gently, who first told us of Mr. Silas Quayle, the assistant Vaughan had brought down from London some 6 weeks before, to help him through the older papers in the castle library. A quiet, well-spoken young man, she said, easy with the servants, careful with the books, and so useful to old Mr. Vaughan that the antiquarian had taken to leaving him alone in the library of an evening with the keys to the older presses, a trust Mrs. Tudor herself thought a little free for so new an acquaintance, though she would not for the world have said so to Mr. Vaughan's face. Mr. Quayle, when we found him, in a small room off the library that had been given over to his use, was indeed a quiet man, fair, perhaps 35, with the particular stillness of someone listening more than he spoke. He answered Holmes's questions about Vaughan's habits and the work they had been doing with what seemed, on the face of it, perfect openness. They had been cataloguing the older parish and estate papers, he said, much of it dull stuff, rent rolls and tithe disputes, though Mr. Vaughan had grown absorbed of late in the older registers, those from before the present church had been built, and had spoken once or twice of finding something there that wanted careful handling before it went further. "Further to whom?" Holmes asked. "He did not say, Mr. Holmes. I had the sense he meant to speak to Sir Aubrey first." It was a clean, plausible answer, and I should have thought nothing more of it had I not seen, as Quayle spoke, that Holmes's eyes had gone once, briefly, to the man's hands, and once to his boots, drying by the small fire, and had stayed there a half-second longer than courtesy required. "We learned that evening, too, of the village's own account of the matter, brought up by the local constable, a slow, decent man named Greer, who arrived to view the body and stayed, as such men will, to talk. The village, he said, had been saying for a week and more that the witch had walked again, on the strength of lights seen in the old keep window, and a child's claim to have seen a grey shape cross the orchard at dusk. Greer himself put no stock in it, but admitted that half the parish would lock its doors early that night regardless. There was, besides, a smaller matter that Holmes pursued with what seemed disproportionate care, a single boot print found in the soft ground at the edge of the orchard, some yards from the clean line to the ice-house, a print that did not match it. Greer was inclined to think it the gamekeeper's, a man called Thomas Pugh, who had old cause to dislike Vaughan, the antiquarian having reported him for poaching some years before. Holmes measured the print twice, frowned, and said nothing further on the subject that night, though I noticed he had not seemed satisfied. It was very late, the house gone quiet and the fire low, when Charles Eldenstone came to find Holmes alone in the library, and told him, with the air of a man confessing to something shameful rather than criminal, that he had not in fact been about the farm that evening, as he had said, but visiting Mrs. Bevan, the schoolmistress in the village, a connection his father would not approve, and which he begged Holmes to keep from him if it could possibly be managed. "It can be managed," Holmes said, "provided it has nothing to do with Mr. Vaughan, which I think on the whole it has not. But you will forgive me for asking exactly when you left her house, and by which road you returned." Chapter 4. What Holmes Did Not Say. I had known Holmes long enough by then to recognize the particular silence that came over him when he had seen something he did not intend to share, and it settled on him that first night at Eldenstone like a second coat, worn close and given away by nothing but a certain economy in his questions, as though he already knew the answers to half of what he asked, and was only confirming them for my benefit, or perhaps for his own satisfaction in having been right. "You have an idea," I said to him, when the house had gone to bed and we sat alone by the library fire, Vaughan's papers still on the table where the dead man had left them. "I have several," he said, "and most of them are wrong, which is the ordinary condition of having ideas at all. I will tell you this much. A single line of footprints to a locked door is not a miracle, Watson, whatever the village would have it be. It is a puzzle, with one piece missing, and I think I know the shape of the missing piece, though not yet where it has gone." He would say no more, and I had learned long since that pressing him in such a mood produced nothing but irritation on both sides, so I let it lie and turned instead to the papers on the table, the dead man's own hand visible in the careful copying of old entries, dates running back 150 years and more. Charles Eldenstone's alibi, when Holmes had pursued it the following morning with a quiet word to Mrs. Bevan herself, proved exactly what the young man had claimed: an unhappy attachment and nothing worse, the schoolmistress confirming the hour of his leaving with the particular bluntness of a woman who had nothing further to be ashamed of and no patience left for being suspected of it. Holmes thanked her, and said to me afterward that a man who lies badly about a small shame is seldom lying well about a large one, which seemed to close that line for good, though he kept Charles's name in his notebook regardless, in the careful hand he used for things not yet finished with. The bootprint troubled him more. Thomas Pugh, the gamekeeper, was a broad-weathered man with a poacher's old grievance against the dead man and an alibi, when pressed, that placed him at the Boar's Head in the village from 7 until past midnight, sworn to by a dozen men who had been drinking with him. Holmes measured his boot against the cast he had taken of the print in the orchard, and shook his head. 2 sizes too small for the print, and the weight wrong besides, he said to me, out of Pugh's hearing. Someone wished us to think of Pugh, Watson, and went to some trouble over it, which tells me a good deal about how this crime was planned, and rather less, yet, about who planned it. It was that same morning that the vicar of the parish, the Reverend Mr. Probert, no relation, he was careful to tell us, to the estate's land agent of the same name, called at the castle with the parish registers Vaughan had been working from, sent for at Sir Aubrey's request, so that Holmes might see for himself what the antiquarian had spent his last weeks upon. He was an old man, anxious and precise, and he handled the great leather volumes as another man might handle a sleeping child. Mr. Vaughan asked to borrow the earliest of them some months back, he said, before the present century, before the present church even, when the parish was kept by the chapel that is now half fallen by the keep. I did not think much of it. He had borrowed older books from me before. Holmes turned the pages with care, and I saw his manner change, very slightly, somewhere in the second volume, a stillness coming over him that I had learned to read as the closing of a trap somewhere in his own mind, well before he was ready to spring it on anyone else. This entry, he said at last, turning the book so the vicar could see it. A marriage recorded some 150 years before. The bride's name struck through with a single careful line and an annotation in a different, later hand beside it. Can you tell me when this alteration was made? The vicar peered at it for a long moment. I cannot say with certainty. It is old work, Mr. Holmes. Older than my time, certainly, and I should think older than the present squire's grandfather, by the ink. And the name struck out. Branwen Price, the vicar read slowly. I had not noticed it before. I confess, there is a story attached to that name in the parish, an old one. They called her a witch, in her day. Holmes closed the book gently, and for the first time since our arrival, I saw something like satisfaction cross his face, though he said nothing further to the vicar on the subject, and turned the talk instead to the weather and the state of the roads, until the old man had gone. Watson, he said, when we were alone again, I think I begin to see the whole shape of this house, and I do not at all like what I see. Fetch your coat. We are going to look at that ice house again, and this time I mean to find the door I have been certain, since last night, must exist somewhere behind it. Chapter 5. The Parish Chronicle. The ice house, examined again by daylight, gave up its secret more readily than I had expected, though I confess I should never have found it myself. Holmes spent the better part of an hour with his hands on the inner wall, working along the join of stone and mortar with the patience of a man reading Braille, until he stopped at last beside an old timber shelf, half-rotted, and asked Pritchard to help him move it aside. Behind it, low in the wall, was a door, iron-banded, that no one living at the castle, Sir Aubrey included, had known to be there. The keep was built against the old chapel crypt, Holmes said, crouching to examine the hinges, which moved, I saw with a small chill, far more freely than 400 years of disuse ought to have allowed. A passage of this kind would have served the family in troubled times, a way out of the keep that did not pass the main gate. It has been forgotten by everyone above ground, and remembered, I think, by exactly one person below it. The passage ran low and close through the hill itself, 100 yards or so of worked stone giving way to rougher tunneling, the air inside it cold and very still, smelling of wet earth and something older than either. I do not care to crawl through such places, and said as much to Holmes, who answered only that a man who had walked it nightly for 6 weeks had plainly found it bearable, and that we owed it to Mr. Vaughan to find it bearable for one afternoon ourselves. The passage came up at last, through a second hidden door, into the disused undercroft of the keep. A cellar room reached, from above, only by a stair behind the library that had not, so far as Sir Aubrey could recall, been opened in his lifetime. The dust on the upper steps told a different story, swept thin in a single recent path, and on the third step from the top, Holmes found, caught on a splinter of the old wood, a single thread of grey worsted, which he held up to the light for a long moment before folding it carefully into his notebook. "A man's coat," he said, "and not a labourer's by the weave. Whoever has been coming and going here has done it in the clothes of a gentleman, which narrows our company a good deal, Sir Aubrey, in a house with as few gentlemen in it as this one." "Someone has been using this for weeks," Holmes said. "Long enough to learn it, well enough to walk it without a light, which a man does not do on his first attempt. Sir Aubrey, who has had the run of your library these last 6 weeks besides yourself and Mr. Vaughan." The squire's face had gone the colour of the old stone around us. "Quayle," he said, "God forgive me, I never thought to ask how he came to know the house so well, so quickly." It was the parish chronicle itself, brought to the library table that afternoon and gone through page by page with the vicar's help, that gave Holmes the rest of what he wanted, and gave me, for the first time, the full shape of the thing we had walked into. The entry the vicar had shown us, the marriage of 150 years before with the bride's name struck through, was only the oldest thread. Branwen Price, herb wife and healer to half the parish in her day, had been secretly married to an Eldenstone heir, and when the match became known, the family of that time, unwilling to see the name allied to a woman of her station, had put about the story that she was a witch, had the marriage struck from the register by a curate willing to be paid for the work, and seen her driven from the parish within the year. She had not been seen again, and the legend that grew up afterward of a wronged woman's ghost walking the keep when the family's fortunes turned was, Holmes said dryly, the oldest and most effective kind of cover a family could ask for, since no one troubles to investigate a ghost. It was not, however, the only marriage the Eldenstone family had found it convenient to erase. Sir Aubrey called to the library to see the entry for himself, read it twice over, and said, in the flat voice of a man refusing to let his face show what he felt, that he had heard some servant's tale of a witch in his childhood, and never once thought to ask whether a real woman lay underneath it. The vicar, for his part, looked a good deal more shaken than the squire, and said that he had read that register 100 times in the ordinary way of parish business, and never once paused over the altered name, which Holmes said was exactly the design of it, an alteration meant to be passed over rather than noticed, and which had done its work for 150 years, precisely because no one had thought it worth a second look. Among Vaughan's own working papers, set apart in a locked drawer the vicar had a duplicate key to, Holmes found copies of correspondence 40 years old between Sir Aubrey's late father and a solicitor in Sydney concerning one Owen Tregarron, the old squire's younger brother, sent abroad after some quarrel and reported, in the family's own later account, to have died there unmarried. The correspondence told a different story. Owen Tregarron had married, in the colony, a woman of no particular fortune, and had a son by her before his death, a fact the old squire had paid the solicitor handsomely to keep from any English register, lest the boy ever think to press a claim against the estate his elder brother held. "My father never spoke of a brother at all," Sir Aubrey said, low, almost to himself. "I had thought myself an only son until this very hour." "The son's name," Holmes said, reading the last letter with a stillness I did not like, "is given here as Hugh." He set the paper down and looked, for a long moment, toward the library door, beyond which, we had been told not 10 minutes before, Mr. Silas Quayle had gone out walking, as he did most afternoons, toward the village. "I think, Sir Aubrey," Holmes said, "that we have been entertaining your cousin under another name, and that Mr. Vaughan, going through these very papers, had very lately worked out the same thing, and meant, like an honest man, to bring it to you himself before he told anyone else at all. I am sorry to say it is the worst possible thing he could have done, for the man he told it to first, without knowing it, was Hugh Tregarron himself." Chapter 6. The Witch Must Be Laid. The household took the news, as such households generally take a thing that threatens both grief and scandal at once, which is to say badly, and with a great deal of energy spent on wishing it were not true rather than on deciding what to do about it. Sir Aubrey's first instinct, and I cannot say I blamed him for it entirely, was to have the man taken up at once, brought before Greer, and the whole business closed before nightfall. His second instinct, arriving close on the heels of the first, was to wonder aloud whether it might not be managed more quietly still. The papers burned, the cousin paid to go back where he came from, and Vaughan's death allowed to remain what the village already believed it, a misfortune laid at the door of an old superstition rather than a living man. "He is family," the squire said, more than once, in a voice that asked less for agreement than for permission. "Whatever he has done, he is my uncle's son." It was Eleanor, of all the household, who spoke against him, white-faced and steady, reminding her father in a few short words that Vaughan had been family too, in every sense but blood, and had died alone and cold for the crime of being honest, and that a witch story, used once already to cover one shameful marriage in this house, had no business being asked to cover a murder as well. Lady Eldenstone, roused at last from her room by the noise of the household below, came down to hear the worst of it, standing rather than seated, and said, when her husband had finished, that she had never trusted a man who catalogued other people's secrets for a living, and that she had said as much to Vaughan's face more than once over the years. In jest, she had thought at the time, though it no longer felt like jest to her now. She did not weep, but stood very straight by the cold hearth with her hands folded, and it was she, in the end, who told her husband plainly that a family which had already buried one woman's name to save its own comfort had no right to bury a second death the same way, whatever the cost to its pride. The village, meanwhile, had its own pressure to bring. Greer came up that evening to say that the parish was asking, with some heat, that Vaughan be buried without further delay, the old custom in those parts holding that a death laid to the witch's account ought to be put properly into the ground before a second misfortune followed it, and two of the older women had already been to the vicar to say as much. Sir Aubrey, caught between his own household's need for the truth and his tenants' need for a funeral, was inclined to give way to the latter, and it took some plain speaking from Holmes, more direct than I had heard him use with a client in some years, to win 2 days' grace before the burial, on the ground that a man owed at least that much honesty before he was put away under a story that was not the true one. "I do not ask you to make this public, Sir Aubrey," Holmes said. "I ask you to let me finish what Mr. Vaughan began before his own house buries the truth along with him, out of a kindness he did not ask for, and would not, I think, have wanted." The squire gave his 2 days, reluctantly, and asked, as he left the room, whether Holmes meant to have his cousin arrested at once. "Not yet," Holmes said. "A man who has waited 6 weeks to act will not run tonight, provided he does not know we have found his door. I would rather know what he means to do with what he has taken from Mr. Vaughan than have the satisfaction of locking him in a cell with the question unanswered." The vicar, sent for again that evening to settle the matter of the funeral day, added his own quiet word to Greer's, saying that he had buried enough of his parish to know that grief left too long without a ceremony to hold it tended to curdle into exactly the sort of talk already running through the village, and that 2 days, in his long experience, was about the limit of what mourning could bear to wait. Holmes heard him out civilly, and gave no ground beyond what he had already won from the squire, though he told me afterward that he thought the old man's instinct sound enough in its own right, and that he meant to finish his business inside the 2 days, regardless of whether the household pressed him for more. What had been taken, It emerged on a careful search of Vaughan's own rooms was a single folded paper, missing from among his working notes, that the vicar, consulted again, was able to describe from memory well enough for Holmes's purposes, a copy, made in Vaughan's own careful hand from the older Sydney correspondence, of the colonial marriage record itself, the one piece of paper that would have let Hugh Tregarron prove, beyond his own word, exactly who he was.
"He has the proof," Holmes said, "and not yet the courage or the readiness to use it openly, or he would have come to Sir Aubrey himself by now, cousin to cousin, instead of going on quietly cataloguing books under a false name. That tells me he means to choose his own moment, and that the moment has not yet come. I think, Watson, we shall help him believe it has." I asked him what he meant by that, and he told me, walking me through it with the particular relish he kept for the construction of a trap rather than its consequences, that a man who has killed once to protect a secret will move again, and quickly, if he believes that secret is about to slip from his control a second time. "We had," he said, "one advantage Tregarron did not know we possessed, the room in which Vaughan had died, and the dead man's own chair, still standing exactly as the antiquarian had left it, by the library window where he had worked every evening of the 6 weeks his murderer had spent learning to love and hate this house in equal measure." Chapter 7. A Snare in the Dark. Holmes laid his plan that night with the kind of quiet thoroughness he reserved for matters he did not intend to discuss twice, and the household, sworn to silence on his instructions, kept to it with a discipline I had not expected of people so recently and so thoroughly frightened. The scheme itself was simple enough in its bones, though its execution wanted nerve. Holmes would not trust the rumour to a single mouth, knowing how quickly a story told once becomes a story doubted, and so he set it about by 3 separate paths at once. A word to Mrs. Tudor over the household accounts, a word to Pritchard while the man was carrying wood, and a third, dropped almost carelessly, in Eleanor's own hearing, on the understanding that a thing heard from the squire's daughter herself would travel through a country house faster than any servant's gossip could carry it. Word would go about the house, carefully placed where Tregarron, still moving freely among the servants under his assumed name, could not fail to hear it, that Mr. Vaughan's papers had been found to be in greater disorder than first thought, that a second, more complete copy of his recent notes had turned up among items sent ahead to the vicar for safekeeping, and that this second copy, including whatever he had set down concerning the older registers, was to be collected and brought to the library the following evening, before Sir Aubrey decided what was to be done with it. "If he has already taken the one document that matters to him," I said, "why should he trouble himself over a copy he believes incomplete?" "Because he cannot know it is incomplete until he has seen it," Holmes said, "and because a man in his position cannot afford to leave any thread loose that might later be pulled by someone less patient than Mr. Vaughan was. He killed once for certainty, Watson. I do not think he will sleep easily until he believes himself entirely safe, and we are about to offer him what looks like his last chance to make himself so." The library was prepared with care once the rest of the house had gone, ostensibly, to bed. Vaughan's chair was drawn back to its old place by the window, his reading lamp set burning low upon the table beside a leather folder thick enough, in the dimness, to pass for a sheaf of papers, and over the back of the chair Holmes laid the dead man's own grey coat, fetched quietly from his room with Sir Aubrey's shaking permission, the collar turned up in the manner Vaughan had worn it of an evening, against the draught from the old window. It was not, Holmes admitted to me afterward, intended to deceive any man at close range or in good light. It was intended for one moment only, the moment a man crossing a dark room toward a desk, expecting to find it empty, sees instead a seated shape, coat and lamp and stillness, exactly as he had last seen them, and loses, for the half-second that matters, the certainty that the room is safe. "You ask a great deal of one half-second," I said to him, while we waited for the house to settle. "I ask only what every conjurer asks of his audience," Holmes said. "Not belief, only hesitation.
A guilty man's hesitation is worth more to me than an honest man's sworn statement, Watson, for the simple reason that an honest man has nothing in it to betray him, and a guilty one cannot help it. I was placed behind the heavy curtain at the window itself, with instructions to make no sound whatever its cost, and Greer, brought up quietly from the village and sworn as thoroughly to silence as the household had been, waited in the passage beyond the library door, out of sight of anyone entering from the Undercroft stair. Holmes himself took the chair. It was, I will own, one of the more uncomfortable hours I have spent in his company, crouched behind that curtain in the cold library, with the small sounds of the old house settling around us, a door somewhere above us closing, a board creaking under no foot I could identify, the fire let down to embers so that the only real light came from the single lamp at the desk, and Holmes seated motionless in a dead man's coat with a stillness that, even knowing the trick of it, I found I could not watch for long without a chill of my own. More than once in that hour I caught myself listening for a step that did not come, and twice mistook the wind in the old chimney for the sound of the panel beginning to move, so that when it did move at last, I had very nearly stopped expecting it. It was past 1 in the morning, by my watch, when the panel behind the library shelves moved, so quietly that I should have missed it had I not been listening for exactly that sound. And a man's shape came through into the room, pausing at the edge of the lamp's small circle of light, looking toward the desk with the particular wariness of someone expecting an empty house and finding, for one full breath, that it did not look as empty as he had been promised. Chapter 8. The Dead Man's Chair. He did not cry out. I will say that for him, in fairness, though it is very nearly the only thing I can say in his favor concerning that night. He stood quite still at the edge of the lamplight, and I heard his breath change, once, sharply, before the seated figure spoke. From behind the curtain I had a clear view of his face in that single instant, before he had mastered it again, and I have rarely seen a man's composure cost him so much to recover so quickly. "Good evening, Mr. Tregarron," Holmes said, in a voice pitched low and even, not Vaughan's voice at all, and rose from the chair into the light. "Or Quayle, if you prefer it a little longer. I find I no longer much mind which." The man who had called himself Quayle did not run, which surprised me less afterward than it did at the time, for a man who has spent 6 weeks teaching himself the silent use of a hidden passage is not, on the whole, a man given to sudden panic. He stood very still, his hand resting on the door of the panel behind him, as though deciding whether it was still worth using, and when he spoke at last, his voice was steady, almost gentle, the voice, I thought, of a man relieved to set down a weight he had carried further than he had ever meant to. "You found the passage," he said. "I wondered, when the household grew so quiet today, whether you had. I thought I might have one more night of it regardless. It seems I was wrong." Greer came through from the passage at Holmes's word, and the man made no move against him, only watched, with an attention I found harder to bear than any violence would have been, as the constable's hand closed on his arm. "You are Hugh Tregarron," Holmes said, "son of Owen Tregarron and his lawful wife, born in the colony of New South Wales some 34 years ago, and you came to Eldenstone 6 weeks past, under a false name, to learn what proof remained of your father's marriage, before deciding what use to make of it." "I am," he said, "and I will not pretend otherwise to you now, whatever I may have to a magistrate. My father died believing his own brother had erased his marriage and his son from the world for the sake of a quieter inheritance, and he was right to believe it. I came to see whether the proof of it still existed anywhere outside my mother's keeping, and to learn, before I showed my face under my own name, whether I had a family here at all, or only a house full of strangers who had spent 40 years pretending I did not exist." "And Mr. Vaughan," Holmes said. For the first time something moved in the man's composure. A flicker, gone almost before I could be certain I had seen it. "He was kind to me," Tregarron said. "Kinder than I had any right to expect from a man working for the family that had wronged mine. I did not mean for it to come to that. He found the Sydney letters before I had decided what I meant to do with them myself, and he would not leave the matter alone, however I tried to turn him from it. He meant to take what he had found straight to Sir Aubrey that very week, openly, honestly, as he did everything, and I could not let him, not until I had decided for myself what truth this house was going to be told, and in what order. "So you locked an old man into a stone room in January," Holmes said, "and let the cold do what you had not the stomach to do with your own hands." Tregarron's head came up at that, and when he answered, there was something almost devotional in the steadiness of his voice, a man reaching, I thought, for whatever shelter still made sense to him. "As ye sow," he said quietly, "so shall ye also reap." I have read that verse a great many times since, Mr. Holmes, and I will not pretend it has given me comfort, only the bare honesty of knowing exactly what I have become. I did not think of it as murder while I was doing it. I thought of it only as time, a little more time, before the truth came out the way I meant it to come out, and not the way it wished to come out on its own. It was, I think, the nearest he came that night, or afterward, to anything I could call a true confession, and Holmes, watching him with an expression I could not entirely read, said nothing further until Greer had returned, summoned by a low word from Holmes, to fasten the man's wrists and lead him out into the cold passage. "You might have run, while you had the chance of it," I said to Holmes, once the sound of their footsteps had faded toward the yard, and the library had gone quiet again. He stood near enough the panel. "He had already decided not to, before ever he came through it," Holmes said. "A man planning to run does not stand still to discuss theology with the figure in the chair. I think he came tonight half hoping to be caught, Watson, and was only waiting for someone else to do the deciding for him." Chapter 9. The Other Marriage. Sir Aubrey received the whole of it the following morning in his own study, with Eleanor at his side, Lady Eldenstone seated very upright near the window, with her needlework abandoned untouched in her lap, and Charles standing by the window with his back half turned, as though the telling of it were a thing he could not quite bring himself to watch directly. Holmes laid the matter out with the same economy he had used on Tregarron himself, the old quarrel between the brothers, the marriage suppressed by the old squire's money, and a complaisant solicitor. The boy raised abroad, knowing his own father's history far better than he knew the country that had cast him out of it, and the slow, deliberate return under a false name that had cost an old man his life before it had cost the family anything else at all. "He would have had no claim in law," Sir Aubrey said, when Holmes had finished, in the tone of a man clutching at the one fact that seemed to offer him any ground to stand on. "The estate is entailed in the male line, through my father, whatever marriage Owen made or did not make. Hugh's father was the younger son. Nothing in those letters changes that." "No," Holmes agreed. "I do not think Tregarron himself was certain it would, which is, I believe, very much the heart of why he killed Mr. Vaughan when he did, rather than simply asking you outright for the truth and accepting your answer. A man certain of his rights goes to law. A man uncertain of them, raised on a story of his own family's dishonesty, comes quietly first to see how much of that dishonesty still survives in the house that practiced it, before he risks showing his face and being turned away a second time." "Then he killed for nothing," Charles said, from the window, not turning round. "For a claim he never had. He killed," Holmes said, "for the right to be believed, which is not nothing to a man who has spent his whole life being told, by the silence of people who ought to have written to him, that he and his mother did not matter enough to be acknowledged at all. It does not excuse him. I have no wish to excuse him, but I would ask you not to mistake the smallness of his legal claim for the smallness of the wrong done to his father, which was real, and which this house did commit, 40 years before he was old enough to avenge it badly." It was Eleanor who asked, after a long silence, the question I confess I had been waiting for someone to put. "And the witch," she said. "Branwen Price. What had she to do with any of it, beyond the story the village told itself?" "A great deal," Holmes said, "though not in the manner of a ghost. Your family has used the same instrument twice in 150 years. Miss Eldenstone, a marriage it found inconvenient, a register altered to remove it, and a story put about afterward to keep the village from asking why. Branwen Price was driven out and called a witch so that no one would think to ask what had become of an Eldenstone bride beneath the family's notice. Owen Tregarron was declared dead unmarried so that no one would think to ask what had become of an Eldenstone son sent abroad in disgrace. The second silence was built, quite deliberately, in the shadow of the first. Your cousin did not invent the Witch of Eldenstone, Miss Eldenstone. He simply discovered, as Mr. Vaughan discovered before him, that the ghost your family kept in its keep had always been doing rather more useful work than frightening servants. No one in that room found anything to say to that for a long moment, and I think it was the truest thing said in the whole of that long morning, truer, certainly, than anything offered afterward by way of comfort. Chapter 10. By the Library Fire. Tregarron asked, before he was taken from the house for the last time, whether he might speak with Holmes alone, and Greer, after a glance at Holmes, allowed it, standing himself just outside the library door, with the particular patience of a man who has learned that some conversations are better not interrupted, only watched. He sat where Vaughan had sat, in the chair Holmes had used to catch him, and for a while said nothing at all, looking at the cold hearth, as though it held something worth studying. "You will wonder," he said at last, "why I did not simply go to my cousin and ask. I have asked myself the same thing every night since, and I find I still do not have an answer that does either of us much credit. I think I was afraid that if I asked plainly and was refused plainly, I should have nothing left to hope for at all. Whereas if I came quietly and learned the truth for myself first, I could at least choose the manner of my own disappointment. You chose, instead," Holmes said, "the manner of an old man's death." "I did." He said it without flinching, which I had not expected, and which troubled me more, in its way, than any display of grief would have done. "I have turned it over a great many times, Mr. Holmes, in the manner men turn over the verses they were taught as children, and never quite escape. The wages of sin is death. I believed, doing it, that I was only protecting my own. I see now that I was simply paying forward, on an innocent man, a debt this family had been refusing to settle since before either of us was born." He looked up then, and there was, for the first time since the library scene 2 nights before, something almost like peace in his face, the particular stillness of a man who has stopped fighting against the shape of what he has become. "I do not ask you to think well of me," he said. "I ask only that whatever account you give of this to my cousin, you make it plain that my father's marriage was real, and that my mother was no adventuress, whatever convenient story the family found it easier to believe. That much at least I should like to see outlive me, since nothing else of mine is likely to." Holmes was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, it was with a gentleness I had rarely heard him use toward a man he had himself unmasked. "I will see that the truth of the marriage is acknowledged," he said, "for your mother's sake, and your own, if for no other reason than that a lie has already cost this family one death too many. I will not pretend, Mr. Tregarron, that it balances the account. Nothing you have told me tonight changes what was done to Mr. Vaughan, or makes it less than what it was." "No," Tregarron said, "I did not think it would. I had hoped, only, that it might be heard before it was buried, the way everything else in this house has always been buried, quietly, and for the family's convenience." He rose then, without being asked, and crossed to the door himself, pausing only at the threshold to look back once at the cold hearth, and the chair, and the window beyond it where the snow had begun, very softly, to fall again. "Tell my cousin," he said, "that I am sorry it was Mr. Vaughan, and not himself, who paid for what his family began. I think in the end, that is the only apology I have left worth giving." Greer took him out into the white morning without another word from either of them, and Holmes stood a long while at the window after they had gone, watching the snow settle over the path the two men had taken, before he turned at last to the fire and said, in a voice pitched for no one but himself, that he had rarely met a guilty man he disliked less, and rarely regretted a solved case more thoroughly than he regretted this one. Chapter 11. After the Snow. The village buried Idris Vaughan 4 days later, on a morning bright and bitter after the last of the snow, and the church was fuller than I think any service in that parish had been in years. The squire's family in the front pew, and the gamekeeper Thomas Pugh, whatever his old grievance against the dead man, standing bareheaded at the back beside Pritchard and the rest of the estate's men. Sir Aubrey had decided, after a long evening with Holmes and his own conscience, to acknowledge what could be acknowledged without dragging the whole sorry history through a public court. Hugh Tregarron would stand trial for what he had done. That much could not and should not be softened. But the marriage of his father would be recorded, properly and at last, in a letter Sir Aubrey himself wrote to the family solicitor, and a small allowance settled on Tregarron's mother, still living in Sydney, by way of an apology 40 years overdue, and offered, at the end, to the wrong generation to do much good. It was Holmes, on our last evening at the castle, who asked the vicar to bring up the parish chronicle one final time, and turned, without explanation to anyone but myself, to the old entry recording Branwen Price's disgrace, the lurid annotation added beside her struck name by some long-dead curate, detailing the accusations against her in language that had clearly been meant, even at the time, less to record a fact than to manufacture one. "There is an old woman in the village still," he said to the vicar, "by the name of Megan Price, is there not, said locally, to carry that same blood, and blamed for every small misfortune the parish suffers, much as her ancestor was." The vicar admitted that there was, and that the talk had grown louder again these last weeks. The witch story, revived by Vaughan's death, exactly as Holmes had feared it would be. Holmes took a penknife from his pocket, and with the vicar's reluctant permission, cut the single offending page from the old volume and fed it, without ceremony, into the library fire. "The marriage itself stays in the record," he said, watching it burn. "It happened, and an Eldenstone heir is owed at least that much honesty after 150 years. But the slander appended to it by a man paid to write it was never history, vicar, only cruelty, given the appearance of fact, and I see no reason it should go on doing its work in this parish a day longer than it already has. I do not know what became, in the months after, of Megan Price, or whether the burning of one old page in a chronicle did anything at all to quiet a story 150 years in the telling. I know only that the talk in the village had begun, by the time we left, to turn at last toward the plain and dreadful truth of a man in a locked ice-house, rather than toward a woman long dead, who had never deserved the use the parish had made of her memory. Sir Aubrey saw us to the trap himself on the morning of our departure, the snow lying clean and undisturbed now across ground that had so lately carried only one set of footprints, and offered Holmes a fee that Holmes, after a moment's consideration, declined to take in full, asking instead that the difference be put toward the upkeep of Vaughan's grave, a request the squire accepted without argument, and, I think, with some relief at being given one decent thing left to do. Eleanor walked with us as far as the gate, and said, before we climbed up, that she did not know yet how she was meant to feel about any of it. Grief and anger, and something very like pity, all tangled together past separating. "That is not a failure of feeling, Miss Eldenstone," Holmes told her. "It is very often the truest way to feel about a case of this kind. I should be more troubled if you had managed to feel only one thing cleanly." Chapter 12. Baker Street again. We were back in our own rooms within 2 days. The fire built up against a London cold that felt almost gentle after the marches, and Holmes did not speak of Eldenstone again for the better part of a week. occupied instead with a small matter of a missing necklace that bored him within the hour, and which he solved, I think, chiefly to have something to occupy his hands while his mind finished its slower business elsewhere. It was a letter from Sir Aubrey, arriving some 10 days later, that brought the case back into the room between us. Hugh Tregarron had pleaded guilty at the assizes, the squire wrote, sparing the family and himself the ordeal of a contested trial, and had asked, before sentence was passed, that the court be told plainly that his father's marriage had been lawful and his mother an honest woman, a request the judge had allowed to be read into the record, at Sir Aubrey's own quiet urging, before passing the sentence the law required. Holmes read the letter through twice and set it down without comment for a long moment, looking into the fire in the particular way he had when a case had left him with more to think about than he cared to say aloud. He had his apology, in the end, I said, such as it was. He had the one thing he asked for, Holmes said, which was not quite the same as an apology, and which cost his cousin nothing whatever beyond a paragraph spoken aloud in a courtroom he could easily have left unspoken. I find I cannot decide, Watson, whether that is a kindness or merely the cheapest decency a guilty conscience could afford to purchase. I dare say it does not greatly matter to Tregarron now, locked away as he is, and it certainly does nothing at all for Vaughan, who wanted only to be allowed to tell an old friend the truth, and was murdered for the timing of it, rather than the truth itself. He was quiet again, and when he spoke once more, it was in the lower, more private register he kept for the handful of observations he trusted to me and to no one else. "It is the country cases that linger longest, I find," he said. "A London crime is generally a single man's greed or a single man's fear, solved and done with inside a week. But a case like Eldenstone is never only one man's doing. It is 40 years of a family's small dishonesties, allowed to compound quietly in a locked drawer until one winter night they come due all at once, and the bill is presented, as such bills generally are, to whichever innocent happens to be standing nearest the door when it falls." I asked him whether he thought the Witch of Eldenstone would walk again, now that her true story, or the better part of it, had finally been told. Holmes allowed himself, at that, the nearest thing to a smile I had seen from him since the night in that cold library. "I think," he said, "that a story stops walking only when the truth it was built to hide has finally been allowed to lie down in its place. Whether this parish has done that thoroughly enough, I could not say from 150 miles away, and I confess, Watson, that for once I am rather glad it is not mine to judge." He turned back to the fire then, and said no more on the matter that evening, and though we spoke of Eldenstone now and again in the years that followed, it was always briefly, and always, I noticed, with that same small pause beforehand, as though some part of him had left a little of himself behind in that cold library, keeping watch a while longer over a chair that no one, by then, had any further reason to sit in,